Economics at its core is about scarcity. There are infinite wants and only a limited number of resources to allocate to them. These resources include land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, and the efficient allocation of these resources is the objective of economics. To decide on the allocation of resources, we can use the production possibilities frontier, which models the trade-off between how much of one resource to produce at the expense of another. For example, apples and oranges. This model shows that to make some number of apples, we need to sacrifice some number of oranges. This is the opportunity cost of making an apple. These trade-offs are facilitated by the market and the laws of supply and demand. Here, the suppliers have a proportional relationship with price, since if the price of apples goes up, they would be willing to divert more resources from oranges to produce apples. And on the other hand, if the price goes down, resources from apples would be diverted to oranges. In contrast, demand has an inverse relationship with price. If the price of apples were to go up, fewer people would be willing to buy apples, and if the price went down, more people would buy apples. Over time, this will naturally converge towards equilibrium. In a market, there are situations where this natural equilibrium might be changed. For instance, if there's a net negative to producing apples to the environment, this would be an externality or a market failure, since the market is not accounting for the harm that is a result of producing apples, and the government would likely impose some policies to shift the equilibrium. One such policy is imposing a fine on producing apples, which would shift the supply curve to the left and cause the equilibrium price to increase, and the equilibrium demand to decrease. This would lead to a deadweight loss. The government could also impose a minimum equilibrium price of apples, known as a price floor. This minimum price would lead to a surplus of apples since the quantity demanded would be exceeded by the quantity supplied. This would lead to a deadweight loss and a reallocation of resources to other tasks, such as oranges. These government policies are subject to the law of unintended consequences. One such example of this law is the inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. This relationship is modeled by the Phillips curve and demonstrates that as inflation decreases, unemployment increases, while as inflation increases, unemployment decreases, making it difficult to control inflation without causing unemployment in the short run. There are many potential factors that influence inflation, but centrally it is about GDP. GDP is the net total final goods and services that an economy produces. For instance, if an economy produces 10 apples, which are each worth $1, then the GDP of the economy is $10. Inflation, at its core, is the result of an economy not being at its optimal output. In particular, inflation occurs when the aggregate demand is shifted to the right from the optimal output of an economy. There are several theories for correcting this. One such theory states that when inflation occurs, the loanable funds graph, which highlights the relationship between supply and demand of money, with respect to the quantity of loanable funds and interest rates, will show that the demand for money rises, which causes higher interest rates. These high interest rates will naturally cause the borrowing of money to be more challenging. This difficulty to borrow money will result in a decrease in investments, which will cause the supply curve to shift to the left and return to equilibrium. On the other hand, if there is a recession, the opposite would happen. The aggregate demand would shift to the left and cause the interest rates to decrease under the loanable funds graph. This would cause there to be greater investments, particularly by healthy sectors of the economy, which will cause the supply curve to shift to the right and return to optimal equilibrium. This theory that the market will correct itself is called the classical theory, and it relies on a few primary key ideas. First, as Say's law says, supply must create its own demand. For this to be true, prices must be flexible, and since wages are the largest determinant of prices, wages too must be flexible. These constraints for classical theory were criticized by a mathematician named John Maynard Keynes, who stated that while these principles may be true in the long run we are all dead, which means that the economy really needs to be corrected in the short run, and this cannot be done without additional intervention. Keynes' idea revolves around a key principle. Spending money creates more value for the economy. Imagine you buy an apple from a farmer for $1. The farmer might then spend that dollar to buy an orange from another farmer. As the money is spent, it creates value by facilitating the purchase of goods and services. This is known as the velocity of money. The faster the velocity of money is, the more value is generated. Keynes introduced the aggregate expenditure graph to model this pattern, which highlights the relationship between income and expenditure. This graph has a 45-degree line, which is the line where income equals expenditure, and the consumption function, which starts at some finite value, since some money always needs to be spent. The intersection is the point where the consumption equals expenditure, and this shows that a small increase in expenditure results in a much larger increase in GDP. To overcome a recession in this model, the government would need to act. The government could act by increasing spending, and this spending would be scaled up by the multiplier and increase GDP to equilibrium. Here, the supply graph is horizontal and then vertical to indicate that prices and wages are sticky. However, this model has its own problems. First, it relies on the fact that the government will make the right decision at the right time, known as legislative lag and time lag. Furthermore, this has the issue that for the government to spend money, it has to acquire that money through debt, which will shift the money demand and raise interest rates, reducing the impact of spending money through what is known as the crowding out effect. A third alternative to this system is by controlling the money supply. The place in an economy where the most money is created is in banks. For instance, if you deposit money, this money can be loaned out with only the reserve ratio being kept in banks. This process would then repeat until the deposited money has been scaled up by the reciprocal of the reserve ratio. This theory states that by shifting the money supply, you can control interest rates and borrowing, which will control spending and thus control inflation. This can also be combined with the Keynes count to counter the crowding out effect, by borrowing money and increasing the money supply to keep interest rates constant. Economics is a crucial field that helps us make informed decisions about how to allocate our limited resources in order to meet our infinite wants. It allows us to understand the trade-offs and constraints that exist in society and how market forces, such as supply and demand, and government policies can impact the allocation of resources and the efficiency of the economy. By analyzing models like the production possibilities frontier and the Phillips curve, we can better understand the complexities of the economy and make informed decisions about how to promote economic efficiency and well-being for society. Ultimately, the study of economics is vital for understanding and navigating the decisions that shape our world.